The alarm clock rang every day at 5:45 a.m., always with the same metallic sound that seemed more like a warning than an invitation to wake up. Daniel Harper didn't need it. His body already woke up on its own, conditioned by repetition. A small apartment in Phoenix, light-colored walls, furniture too functional for someone who never had time to really use it. Coffee was being prepared while he put on his light blue dress shirt, folded the night before with almost military precision. Daniel worked as an administrative analyst at a logistics company. His salary was stable, his benefits reasonable, and his future too predictable. Everyone around him said he was doing well. He said the same, almost reflexively. But there was something that didn't show up in the spreadsheets or monthly reports, the constant feeling of trading time for survival with no room for error. On the other side of the city, in a glass building reflecting the desert sun, Marcus Reynolds began his day in a very different way. Director of operations at a tech startup, Marcus arrived after 9, unhurried, with artisanal coffee in hand, and meetings scheduled only to validate decisions that had already been made. He spoke confidently about innovation, automation, and scalability, words that in practice meant reducing human costs to the bare minimum. Marcus wasn't exactly a classic villain. He believed in what he did. For him, efficiency was synonymous with progress. People who didn't adapt were left behind. It's that simple. Daniel was on that invisible list of people, not because of incompetence, but because he didn't see the big picture. The conflict began quietly, almost unnoticed. One Monday morning, Daniel received an internal email informing him that part of the administrative sector would undergo AI-assisted restructuring. But the language was gentle, almost friendly. No immediate layoffs, they said, just adjustments. But the adjustments began quickly. Tasks previously distributed among 5 people were now being done by a single integrated system. Daniel began reviewing the work of an AI that never got tired, never made simple number mistakes, and never complained. The free time that arose did not bring relief. It brought fear. While colleagues celebrated the modernization, Daniel began to notice details previously ignored. Empty desks that were never reoccupied, deactivated name tags without formal announcements, meetings cancelled without explanation. Marcus, in internal presentations, showed upward trending graphs and spoke about resource optimization. Daniel saw faces disappearing. It was on one of those idle afternoons, sitting in front of the computer with little to do, that Daniel opened an incognito tab in his browser. He wasn't looking for a job. He was looking to understand. He typed in generic terms: automation, artificial intelligence, online income, nothing too specific, just curiosity mixed with urgency. He began to notice patterns, short videos, articles repeating concepts, promises too exaggerated to be true. Daniel ignored almost everything. What caught his attention wasn't the quick profits, but the processes. Ordinary people showing simple, discrete, almost invisible systems. They weren't talking about getting rich. They were talking about creating something that would work while they slept. That night, instead of turning on the television, Daniel opened an old hardcover notebook that had been forgotten in a drawer. He began to jot down ideas without any commitment. Not grand plans. Just questions. What can be automated without drawing attention? Where do people already spend money without realizing it? What can be created once and reused infinitely? Nothing there seemed revolutionary, but there was something new. Daniel was no longer just reacting. He was observing the system from the outside. In the following days, he began using small, freely available AI tools. He didn't tell anyone. He tested them during lunch, adjusted them at night. He created simple texts, analyzed public data, and compared results. There was no euphoria, just method. Each failed attempt was discarded without drama. Each success was noted. Marcus, for his part, announced yet another phase of automation. In a general meeting, he spoke about how the company was at the forefront of the future of work. Daniel watched in silence, realizing the irony. The same technology that threatened his job was, little by little, offering a way out. The element of doubt arose when Daniel received a personal email outside of business hours, an invitation to a private meeting with HR and Marcus. No explanation, just the date and time. He closed his notebook that night without finishing his tests. For the first time in weeks, the notebook remained untouched. Not for lack of ideas, but because of a question that kept nagging at him without a clear answer. It was too late to turn the tide, or too early to give up. Daniel didn't yet have an extra income. He had no guarantees. He only had something he had never explored before, the combination of curiosity, silence, and strategic action. And, without realizing it, he was already on a path that would completely change his relationship with money, work, and time. The company building where Daniel worked seemed too modern for those who lived there. Mirrored windows, silent corridors, motion sensors controlling light and temperature. Everything functioned with calculated efficiency, but there was something artificial about that excessive organization, as if the space had been designed for machines before people. Automation wasn't just a corporate strategy. It was the identity of the place. Daniel began to notice this in the small details. Spontaneous conversations at the coffee machine practically disappeared. Colleagues who previously complained about work now talked about metrics, productivity, and adaptation. Those who didn't use these words seemed out of place, as if they were stuck in an old version of the world. He started observing more than talking. The city of Phoenix, with its rapid growth and unforgiving climate, reinforced this feeling. Everything there demanded resilience. The extreme heat shaped routines, schedules, and even people's moods. Technology companies thrived precisely because they promised efficiency in a hostile environment. Daniel had always seen the city as a place to pass through, but now he understood. Phoenix did not forgive those who stood still. Marcus Reynolds perfectly embodied this spirit. The son of immigrants who had started from scratch, Marcus grew up hearing stories about effort, risk, and reward. He genuinely believed that technology was the great social equalizer, provided it was used by those willing to learn quickly. In meetings, he cited data, trends, and success stories. He never mentioned specific individuals. For him, people were variables within a larger system. Daniel didn't hate Marcus. In fact, there were times when he admired him. Marcus had the clarity, vision, and courage to make unpopular decisions. The problem was that these decisions rarely considered those who stood in their way, and Daniel was beginning to feel that he was exactly there, in the way. Outside of work, Daniel's life was simple. Few close friends, almost all in the same financial and professional situation. Quick dinners, conversations about bills, rent, postponed plans. There was a silent consensus that that's just how it is. No one said it aloud, but everyone acted as if it were an immutable rule. Gradually, Daniel began to distance himself from these routines, not out of arrogance, but out of a need for focus. His nights became occupied with practical experiments. He explored digital platforms, observed consumer behavior, and analyzed comments, reviews, and complaints. AI was not used as an end in itself, but as an amplification tool. It accelerated testing, reduced initial errors, and allowed him to validate ideas in hours, not weeks. A secondary character began to gain importance in this process, Linda Cooper, a colleague from the finance department. Linda was discreet, efficient, and always seemed one step ahead. Unlike the others, she neither celebrated automation nor openly criticized it. She simply adapted. During a casual lunch, she commented on something that stuck in Daniel's mind. The problem isn't AI replacing people. It's depending on a single source of income and calling that security. The comment came without advice or explanation. Linda offered no help nor asked any questions. She simply went back to work. But that observation fit perfectly with what Daniel had been silently building up. He began to better structure his tests. He wasn't looking for something grandiose, but replicable. Small solutions for specific problems, simple digital tools, automated pages, AI-generated content adjusted with human logic. Each action had a clear objective: to create something that worked without requiring constant presence. The cultural context of the United States was helpful. There was greater acceptance of failure as long as it was done quietly. Daniel could test ideas without social exposure. If it went wrong, nobody needed to know. If it went right, the results would speak for themselves. This implicit freedom was essential. Meanwhile, at work, Marcus was announcing partnerships with technology companies and reinforcing the importance of an owner mentality. The irony did not go unnoticed by Daniel. Having an owner mentality in that context meant taking risks without participating in the profits. This bothered him more than any direct threat of dismissal. Daniel began to see his own journey as a project. He defined personal metrics: time invested, return obtained, level of dependence on formal employment. Each small advance increased his confidence, not for immediate money, but for control. For the first time, he was not exclusively dependent on decisions made in closed rooms by people like Marcus. The relationship between protagonist and antagonist, though indirect, was becoming increasingly clear. Marcus represented the system that centralized power and efficiency. Daniel was beginning to represent silent decentralization, the creation of alternatives outside the corporate radar. No direct confrontation yet, just opposing moves on the same chessboard. Linda watched from afar. She didn't interfere, but she noticed subtle changes in Daniel's behavior. He seemed less tense, more focused. He left on time, refusing unnecessary overtime. Not out of rebellion, but because his time now had a different value. The world around him kept spinning fast. News about AI dominated headlines. Promises of easy wealth appeared and disappeared. Daniel ignored the noise. His focus was on the invisible processes, the simple gears that, when properly adjusted, kept turning on their own. Nothing was certain yet, no clear victory, but the stage was set. The characters had motivations, the environment pressured decisions, and the line between safety and risk began to dissolve. Daniel didn't know exactly where this would lead him, but for the first time he was sure of one thing: he wouldn't be taken. He was choosing his own path. The HR email finally arrived Friday morning. There was no explicit urgency in the subject line, but the tone was deliberately neutral, as if any emotion were undesirable. The meeting with Marcus would take place early the following week. Daniel read the message once and filed it away. He didn't feel immediate panic. He felt focus. From that moment on, time began to have real importance. The hours after work ceased to be merely vague opportunities and became strategic blocks. Daniel reorganized his routine with precision. He reduced distractions, eliminated habits that did not generate returns, and concentrated his energy on experiments that already showed concrete signs of viability. The internal conflict began to intensify. On one hand, the stability of a fixed salary still present. On the other, subtle but consistent signs that something was happening outside that system. Small payment notifications began to appear, low, almost symbolic amounts, but recurring. The pattern caught his attention more than the amount itself. He didn't celebrate, he just analyzed. What made those results different wasn't the manual effort involved, but the lack thereof. Once configured, the tools continued operating. The AI generated content variations, adjusted formats, and responded to basic interactions. Daniel merely supervised. He corrected deviations. He improved the process. In the corporate environment, the changes became more visible. The company announced a new internal system that would replace human reports with automated dashboards. Part of the team was reassigned. Another part was laid off with discrete packages. The atmosphere grew colder, the conversations more cautious. Nobody wanted to be next. Marcus handled everything with almost clinical serenity. In presentations, he talked about numbers and efficiency, but avoided looking directly at those he knew would be impacted. He believed he was doing what was necessary for the company's survival, and in technical terms, he was right. Daniel began to feel the tension of walking in two worlds. During the day, he performed his duties competently. At night, he built something that, if successful, would make that job optional. This duality began to affect his decisions. He refused to participate in an extra project that would require weekends. He didn't give lengthy explanations. He simply said he couldn't take it on. The response was a brief glance from Marcus during a meeting. Not hostile, evaluative. The external conflict took on new layers when Linda approached him discreetly in the parking lot. She didn't directly ask about extra income or AI. She simply mentioned that the company was planning another round of cuts after the next quarter. The information wasn't delivered as a threat, but as a warning. Daniel thanked him and asked no further questions. That confirmation sped everything up. He began to refine his systems more rigorously. He automated basic customer service, created filters to eliminate redundant tasks, and tested different monetization models. Some failed quickly. Others showed potential but required fine-tuning. Learning was constant, but time was pressing. The emotional tension didn't stem from the fear of losing their job, but from the possibility of depending on it for longer than necessary. Every decision now carried strategic weight. Buying something, accepting an invitation, spending an extra hour on something unproductive, everything was evaluated. Marcus, for his part, was beginning to notice inconsistencies in the individual performance reports. Daniel continued to deliver results, but didn't demonstrate the same emotional commitment. For someone like Marcus, this was a warning sign. Engaged people defended the system. People prepared to leave only did the bare minimum. The antagonism was not yet declared, but it was latent. Two world models clashed silently. One centralized, scalable, and impersonal. The other decentralized, automated, and individual. The same technology fueled both, but with opposing purposes. The conflict intensified when Daniel received a formal invitation for a one-on-one conversation with Marcus. It wasn't a termination meeting, at least not officially. The invitation mentioned aligning expectations and professional future. Daniel arrived at the office that day, wearing the same clothes as always. No outward changes. Internally, however, there was clarity. He already knew that, regardless of the outcome, his dependence had lessened. The systems would continue to function with or without his physical presence there. During the conversation, Marcus spoke about growth opportunities, new responsibilities, and the importance of total commitment. He didn't make any direct accusations, he simply observed. Daniel responded objectively, without grand promises. He said he valued the company, but also sought autonomy in the long term. There was a brief silence. Marcus realized something he didn't like. Daniel wasn't asking for permission. As he left the room, Daniel felt the weight of the moment. The conflict was no longer theoretical, it was concrete. His choices were being examined, evaluated. The risk had increased, but along with it, his conviction. That night, while reviewing his automated dashboards, Daniel saw something different. Not an unexpected spike, but stability. Small, continuous inputs, without interruption. The system was working exactly as planned. The conflict now had a clear form. He would either continue betting everything on a system he didn't control, or he would definitively move towards a model where his decisions shaped the outcome. And time to decide was running out. The first subplot began almost imperceptibly, hidden within the automated routine Daniel had created. One of the systems he was testing, simple, functional and silent, began to attract a specific type of user. These weren't casual onlookers or people looking for quick money. They were weary, attentive professionals who recognized value in practical solutions. This audience demanded consistency over volume, and this brought a new layer of responsibility. Daniel realized that simply letting the system run wasn't enough. Small strategic adjustments made all the difference. A change in the publication schedule, a refinement in the AI-generated language, more precise segmentation. The subplot wasn't about explosive growth, but about support if that were to fail. It wouldn't be due to a lack of technology, but to human negligence. At the same time, another complexity arose in the corporate environment. The company announced an internal AI training program, presented as an employee benefit. In practice, it was a filter. Those who learned quickly would stay. Those who didn't keep up would become dispensable. Daniel participated without resistance, not out of interest in the certificate, but to understand how the system thought. There, he realized something crucial. The company taught us no independence AI was presented as a tool to optimize internal processes, never as a means to create assets of his own. This difference reinforced his conviction that he was on the right track, but also increased the risk. He now deeply understood the very mechanism that threatened his position. Linda, for her part, was facing her own subplot. She had been quietly promoted, but along with the promotion came an invisible burden, responsibility for decisions that affected close colleagues. In brief conversations, Daniel noticed subtle changes in her, more cautious, less spontaneous. She was closer to the center of the system, and that came at a price. The relationship between the two took on new nuances. There was no conspiracy or shared plans, only a tacit understanding. Both knew that the environment was becoming less human and more strategic. Linda began to share information more carefully, choosing her words and moments. Daniel, in turn, came to understand that not every warning came in the form of an explicit alert. Time pressure intensified when an external deadline arose. Daniel's rental contract was due for readjustment in 3 months. The increase was significant. This transformed a strategic decision into a concrete necessity. He calculated scenarios, revised expenses, and assessed risks. There was no room for illusions. Either the alternative system would become reliable, or he would have to submit to a longer period of dependence. Another subplot emerged from a mistake. One of the automated flows malfunctioned for several hours, generating inconsistent responses. Daniel quickly fixed it, but the impact was immediate. Cancellations, questions, silence. This revealed a real vulnerability. Automating didn't mean abandoning, it meant intelligent monitoring. This failure led to an important decision: to reduce complexity. Daniel eliminated secondary resources, focused on what truly generated value, and made the system leaner. Fewer promises, more delivery. This choice reduced volume but increased trust. It was a move contrary to what he saw in the corporate environment, where more resources meant more control. Here, less meant stability. At work, Marcus faced his own pressure. Investors demanded faster results. The promise of efficiency needed to translate into clear numbers. This led him to accelerate decisions, reducing the team's adaptation time. The atmosphere became even more tense. People began to silently compete for relevance. Daniel felt the direct impact when his department received more aggressive goals with fewer human resources. He fulfilled what was necessary, but realized that this pace was not sustainable in the long term. The corporate subplot was moving towards a breaking point, and he was at the center of it, even while trying to get out. Time began to squeeze everything on all fronts, adjusting systems, maintaining work performance, dealing with financial uncertainties, and preserving mental sanity. Daniel began operating on the edge, but with clarity. Every action had a purpose. Every choice meant discarding something. The subplots began to converge. The automated system was more stable, the company more unstable, Linda quieter, Marcus more pressured, and Daniel paradoxically calmer, not because everything was resolved, but because the variables were mapped out. He understood that the real conflict wasn't between him and Marcus, nor between human and machine. It was between dependence and autonomy. The subplots existed to test this understanding. Each one pushed Daniel toward a definitive decision, without motivational speeches or major revelations. The clock kept ticking. The rent increase was approaching. The next round of cuts was also coming. The system needed to prove, in a short time, that it wasn't just a successful experiment, but a real alternative. And for the first time, Daniel realized that he was no longer thinking about if it would work. He was only thinking about when I would need to take the next step. The warning didn't come via email or formal meeting. It came as a silent change to the shared agenda. Daniel noticed one Tuesday morning that his name had been removed from 2 upcoming projects. There was no explanation, just the absence. To someone attentive to patterns, that spoke volumes. He didn't react immediately. He carried out his duties as normal, delivered what was still under his responsibility, and avoided making any comments. But internally, something was reorganizing itself. This was no longer a distant possibility. It was a concrete sign that the system had already made its choice, even without communicating it openly. On the same day, something unexpected happened outside of work. An automated report, which Daniel rarely reviewed manually, showed atypical behavior, not an artificial spike nor a failure, organic, consistent growth coming from a single source. He investigated calmly and realized that someone had spontaneously shared the service he had created in a closed professional forum. No exaggerated promises, no aggressive marketing, just a simple account of use and results. That changed everything. Until then, Daniel had operated with extreme caution, almost in secret. Controlled growth was part of the strategy, but that external validation, outside of his direct control, proved something essential. The system no longer depended solely on him. He had created something that survived his constant presence. The revelation didn't come with euphoria. It came as a cold clarity. If things continued like this, the financial break-even point would arrive sooner than expected. Perhaps not to abandon everything immediately, but to make a choice. The real turning point came 2 days later, during an unexpected general meeting. Marcus showed up earlier than usual, with a restrained expression. He announced an immediate strategic reorganization. The speech was technical, impersonal, full of carefully chosen terms. At the end, a list of impacted positions appeared on the screen. Daniel's position was in that role. There was no drama, no individual calls at that moment, just the collective information and the promise of private conversations throughout the week. Daniel felt the real weight of the decision that had been pushed into the future. The corporate system had reached the limit of its usefulness to him. As he left the room, Linda caught up with him in the hallway. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She simply confirmed with a slight nod. She already knew, perhaps before everyone else. Her eyes showed conflict, not guilt, but awareness. This was the direct consequence of the decision she was now helping to implement. That night, Daniel didn't work on the systems. He sat on the sofa, the light off, simply watching the city through the window, the distant noise of the traffic, the persistent heat even after sunset. Everything seemed the same, but it wasn't. He mentally revisited each step. The nights of testing, the silent mistakes, the decisions to simplify, the moments when he almost gave up from exhaustion. Everything converged on that moment. The turning point wasn't the imminent dismissal, it was the realization that he no longer needed to negotiate his survival. The following day, the one-on-one conversation took place. Marcus was direct. He explained the reasons, spoke of strategic alignment, and offered a reasonable transition package. nothing personal. Daniel listened attentively, asked few questions, and didn't try to argue. When Marcus asked about the next steps, Daniel answered with controlled honesty, "I'm going to focus on my own projects." There was a pause. Marcus assessed that response with more interest than surprise. For the first time, he seemed to see Daniel not as a resource, but as someone who had understood the same game, just from a different angle. The emotional impact came later, outside of work. While organizing his belongings, Daniel realized he didn't feel loss. He felt liberation. The fear he had imagined for years hadn't materialized. In its place, there was responsibility. Now, there was no fixed salary to cushion mistakes. That same week, the automated system surpassed a symbolic recurring revenue threshold. It wasn't wealth, it was predictability. Enough to cover basic expenses with a margin, enough to say no to imposed decisions. The final twist came from where Daniel least expected it. Linda asked to talk outside the corporate environment. In a discreet cafe, she revealed that she was also preparing to leave. She didn't have a plan, but she had vision. She asked few questions, listened a lot. She wasn't looking for shortcuts, she was looking for understanding. Daniel realized there was something bigger than his own story. What he had built wasn't just extra income. It was a mental model, a different way of positioning himself in relation to work, technology, and time. The turning point did not end the conflict, it redefined it. Now, the challenge was not to escape the corporate system, but to sustain something of their own without repeating the same vices of centralization and dependence. When Daniel closed his laptop that night, he understood that the game had definitively changed. There was no going back to the previous state. And the most surprising thing, he didn't feel like going back. The first few days after leaving the company didn't have the dramatic impact Daniel had imagined for years. There was no immediate feeling of victory, nor of absolute emptiness. There was silence, a strange silence, uncomfortable at first, but revealing. For the first time in a long time, the mornings weren't accompanied by external urgency. There was no badge, corporate agenda, or mandatory meetings. There were only choices. This new scenario brought immediate practical consequences. Daniel began to realize how much his previous routine was shaped by external demands. Now, every decision had a direct effect on the outcome. Sleeping more meant fewer adjustments to the system. Working too much generated unnecessary strain. He needed to quickly learn something that had never been required of him before: real self-management. Financially, the impact was felt gradually. The transition package offered by the company created a false sense of initial security, but Daniel treated that money as a temporary solution, not a fix. He adjusted his lifestyle, cut automatic expenses, and created clear reserves. Each action was designed to extend the maneuvering time, not for immediate comfort. The automated system responded predictably, which was both a relief and a warning. Inflows continued, but any fluctuation seemed larger now that there was no fixed salary to compensate. Daniel began to monitor metrics more closely, not out of anxiety, but out of responsibility. Small drops were analyzed coldly. Small increases were treated with caution. External reactions began to emerge. Close friends reacted with curiosity mixed with disbelief. Some showed restrained admiration, others concern disguised as advice. Questions arose frequently, almost always accompanied by skepticism. What if it doesn't last? Don't you think it's too risky? Daniel didn't try to convince anyone. He had learned that long explanations rarely changed perceptions. Linda kept in touch. She no longer talked about the company, but she closely observed Daniel's progress. Their conversations began to revolve around decisions, not complaints. She perceived the weight of the choices and understood that this path required more discipline than it seemed from the outside. The relationship between the two evolved into something based on intellectual exchange, not dependence. Marcus, for his part, represented a distant but significant reaction. Daniel learned from third parties that the company was struggling to maintain the pace promised to investors. Automation had reduced costs, but also eliminated tacit knowledge. Systems worked, but human decisions needed constant review. Extreme efficiency was beginning to take its toll. This information brought no satisfaction, only confirmation. Daniel didn't see Marcus as a personal enemy, but as a symbol of a model that worked up to a certain point. Now, away from that environment, he understood better the limits of purely corporate logic. Internally, Daniel faced his own most difficult reactions. The absence of constant external validation generated moments of self-doubt. There were no performance reviews or imposed goals. Success had to be defined by himself. On some days, this was liberating. On others, paralyzing. He responded by creating simple structures, flexible but consistent schedules, clear yet adjustable weekly goals, periodic but not obsessive reviews of the system. This self-imposed discipline became the emotional foundation of his new lifestyle. The consequences of the turning point also manifested themselves in his relationship with technology. Daniel stopped seeing it as a salvation and began to treat it as a partner. AI remained essential, but now it required strategic oversight. He understood that delegating everything was as dangerous as controlling too much. The balance came from understanding the process, not the tool. An unexpected event reinforced this perception. A small external adjustment to a platform he was using temporarily impacted the system's operation. Nothing serious, but enough to reveal vulnerabilities. Daniel reacted quickly, adapted workflows, and diversified sources. That agile reaction was possible precisely because he was no longer bound by rigid structures. The emotional consequences extended to how Daniel saw himself. He no longer presented himself by the position he held. When asked what he did, he answered simply and objectively. There was no need for elaborate labels. The focus was on the process, not on professional identity. Time passed at a different pace. Without the artificial division between weekdays and weekends, Daniel had to relearn how to rest. Working all the time didn't mean progressing faster. This was one of the hardest reactions to accept. Real productivity didn't come from exhaustion, but from clarity. Observing the system's stable operation for several consecutive weeks, Daniel realized something fundamental. The consequences of the tipping point weren't just external. Internally, he had stopped operating out of fear. Decisions now came from analysis, not from imposed urgency. The original conflict still existed, but it had changed form. It was no longer about escaping a job. It was about maintaining autonomy without creating a new prison. This awareness shaped every future choice. At the end of that initial period, Daniel understood that the true impact of the turning point was not in leaving the company, but in the silent transformation of his relationship with work, money, and time. And this transformation was far from over. The next phase didn't begin with major decisions, but with almost invisible adjustments. Daniel quickly realized that keeping the system running wasn't the same as making it evolve. The automatic income existed, but it was still fragile. It depended on external platforms, on behavioral patterns that could change without warning. To grow, he would have to face something more difficult than learning technology, taking calculated risks without guarantees. The first challenge came from stagnation. The metrics had stabilized at a comfortable level, but weren't progressing. For many, that would have been enough. For Daniel, it was a warning sign. Excessive comfort was just another form of dependency. He decided to test new formats, not to increase volume quickly, but to reduce vulnerabilities. These tests required something he had been avoiding: exposure. Until then, everything had operated behind the scenes. Now, some processes would need identity, positioning, and clarity of purpose. Daniel hesitated. Making something visible meant attracting attention, and attention came with criticism, competition, and comparison. He went ahead anyway. He created more robust structures, separated functions, and organized workflows. AI began to operate in layers: generation, analysis, and optimization. Daniel no longer performed repetitive tasks, he made strategic decisions. This shift in role marked real growth. He went from being an operator to becoming the system architect. Personal growth came with new emotional challenges. There were days of frustration when adjustments didn't yield immediate results. There were moments of doubt, especially when observing online narratives promising quick and unrealistic results. Daniel learned to ignore this noise. His progress wasn't spectacular, but it was consistent. Linda watched from a distance, now outside the company. She had resigned weeks later and was beginning her own transition process. She wasn't copying Daniel's path, but she was inspired by its logic. Their conversations became deeper, less technical, and more strategic. They both understood that growth wasn't about accelerating, but support. The greatest test of resilience came when Daniel decided to deliberately reduce a source of income that was overly dependent on a single platform. Financially, the decision seemed counterintuitive. Psychologically, it was liberating. He preferred to earn less temporarily rather than become a hostage to a single channel. This movement required discipline. He compensated for the reduction by investing time in more durable assets: proprietary structures, replicable processes, data control. None of this generated immediate returns. It was underground growth, invisible to those looking from the outside. Daniel realized that he was changing not only what he was doing, but how I thought previously. Success was measured by stability. Now, it is measured by resilience. The more the system withstood external changes without collapsing, the stronger it became. AI remained central, but now it was approached with more maturity. Daniel understood its limitations, its biases, and its strengths. He no longer sought ready-made answers, but efficient combinations of automation and human judgment. This integration was the true leap in growth. Over time, the results began to reflect this change, not in abrupt peaks, but in a trend. Revenue grew slowly, but with less volatility. The time required decreased. Daniel could step away for days without everything falling apart. This was something he had never experienced in his traditional job. Growth also manifested itself in how he dealt with uncertainty. Problems ceased to be emotional threats and became technical variables. When something failed, Daniel didn't question himself as a person. He adjusted the system. This separation between identity and results was an important milestone. Looking back, Daniel realized that overcoming his challenges didn't come from a single act of courage, but from a series of conscious decisions. None of them were heroic in isolation. All were underpinned by the same logic: reduce dependence, increase control, and preserve flexibility. The arc of transformation was clear now. He was no longer someone trying to escape a system. He was someone building his own, with defined boundaries and a functional purpose. The growth wasn't just financial, it was structural, mental, and emotional. Daniel understood that this path would not make him immune to future failures, but it gave him something more valuable: responsiveness, and that changed everything. At the end of that phase, he no longer wondered if he could continue. The question now was different, more complex and more promising. How far could that model go without losing its essence? The preparation phase yielded no visible novelties for an outside observer, but internally, everything was accelerating. Daniel felt he had reached a delicate point. The system worked too well to be treated as an experiment, and too small to be considered definitive. Staying there for too long would be dangerous. Stagnation meant opening the door to strategic errors. He began by resolving pending subplots. Automations that had been maintained for convenience were reviewed. Some were terminated unceremoniously. Others were integrated into a more robust central core. Daniel wanted operational simplicity. The closer to the climax, the fewer loose variables he accepted. The relationship with Linda entered a new phase. She was now testing her own projects and sharing her learnings in a timely manner. There was no formal partnership, but there was intellectual trust. In some conversations, the same concern arose. To what extent could one grow without losing autonomy? Both had seen firsthand how overly large structures could stifle decision-making. Daniel decided that the climax would not be an externally imposed event, but a strategic choice. He set an internal deadline, not a public or financial deadline, but a decision-making one. Within a few weeks, he would make a move that would either consolidate everything that had been built up or expose irreversible flaws. This move required emotional preparation. Income already covered expenses, but there were still fluctuations. Daniel needed to accept that the risk wouldn't disappear at the climax. It would simply change form. Instead of fear of being fired, it would be fear of making mistakes alone. This awareness brought focus. Tensions rose when Daniel began receiving clear signs of outside interest. Not direct proposals, but exploratory contacts. People who had encountered his system wanted to understand how it worked. He realized the immediate danger, turning something efficient into something too explainable. Excessive popularization could attract unwanted attention, predatory competition, or even dependence on third parties. He refused invitations that didn't align with his logic. Each no increased the internal tension, but preserved his control. Preparing for the climax required renunciation. Not every opportunity was progress. Technically, Daniel reinforced critical points. He created redundancies, documented essential processes, and reduced single points of failure. The AI began to operate with more conservative parameters, less aggressiveness, more consistency. He knew that the climax would require maximum stability. The external environment seemed to conspire to accelerate everything. Changes in digital policies, adjustments to algorithms, new regulations being discussed. Nothing directly affected their system at that moment, but everything indicated that the terrain was becoming more unstable. This increased the urgency of consolidating something of their own. Daniel also revisited his own motivation. He honestly asked himself what he was seeking at that point. It wasn't total freedom, nor unlimited growth. It was choice, the ability to decide when to accelerate and when to brake. The climax should preserve that. On a quiet night, he opened the old notebook he had started months before. The first questions were there, scribbled vaguely. Now the answers were implicit in every decision made. What could be automated had been. What required human presence remained under his control. The system reflected his vision, not the other way around. Linda commented in a casual conversation that this phase seemed more tense than the beginning. She was right. Before, Daniel had little to lose. Now, he had something working. The preparation for the climax was, paradoxically, the moment of greatest vulnerability. He then decided to conduct one last, deliberate test. An adjustment that could significantly improve the results or compromise stability. It wasn't necessary, but it was revealing. The test required confidence in the system and in his own interpretation of the scenario. Daniel implemented the adjustment and stepped away. He didn't monitor it obsessively. He let the system respond. That wait concentrated all the tension that had accumulated up to that point. It was the final rehearsal for the climax. The following days were strangely calm. No serious failures, no artificial spikes, just consistent behavior. The test had passed. This didn't mean victory, but confirmation. The system was ready to handle a bigger decision. The climax was no longer a distant threat, it was a logical consequence. Everything was converging on a moment when Daniel would have to take a definitive stand, not against anyone, but in favor of a model of life and work that he himself had built. As that preparation phase came to a close, Daniel felt something rare, not anxiety, but presence. He was aware of every relevant variable. He knew what he could control and what he needed to accept. The stage was set, the central conflict was ripe for discussion, and any move from that point on would change everything. The moment arrived without fanfare. It came on an ordinary morning, with the sun streaming through the blinds and illuminating the same simple apartment where it had all begun. Daniel woke before his alarm, not out of anxiety, but out of clarity. The final test had already been absorbed by the system. The data was consolidated. There were no more relevant assumptions, only decision. The climax would not be a public launch or a visible, radical change. It would be a silent, yet irreversible repositioning. Daniel sat down at his computer and opened the central panels. Everything was working as expected. Stable automation, organic demand, minimal support. The AI operated like a well-oiled cog, not as the main player. This confirmed what he had been building. Income not based on constant presence, but on structure. The central conflict became clear at that moment. It was no longer between employment and autonomy. It was between impersonal scale and conscious control. Growing quickly would require giving up decisions. Growing strategically would require saying no to tempting shortcuts. The turning point came when Daniel realized he didn't have to choose between growing up or preserving his autonomy. He could redefine his own concept of growth. The decisive move was simple, almost anticlimactic. Daniel deliberately deactivated an acquisition channel that had been growing too fast, but was attracting users who were misaligned with the system's purpose. Financially, this represented an immediate setback. Strategically, it was a filter. He chose quality and predictability over volatile volume. At that moment, the system reacted. It didn't collapse. It adjusted. Demand decreased, but retention increased. Support was reduced. The time required dropped drastically. That confirmed something essential. The system now obeyed criteria defined by itself, not by external algorithms. That was the protagonist's true transformation. Daniel stopped reacting to metrics and started to set limits. The climax wasn't about beating someone, but about gaining complete control over the model. Tensions reached a peak when, almost simultaneously, he received a formal partnership proposal. A company wanted to integrate his system into a larger solution. The promise was clear: rapid scalability, broad exposure, and superior financial return. In exchange, Daniel would lose autonomy over key decisions. For a few minutes he considered it, not out of greed, but out of strategic curiosity. This was the opportunity many had been seeking, the pinnacle of traditional gaming. And that's exactly why he refused. The refusal was straightforward, without lengthy justifications. Daniel understood that accepting would mean recreating in a different format the same dependency he had escaped. The climax demanded consistency, not applause. As he finished the message, he felt the true emotional impact of the moment. There was no external validation, no celebration, just the certainty that this decision sealed his transformation. He was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. Linda learned of the decision hours later. Her reaction wasn't surprise, but respect. She realized that this act solidified something bigger than extra income. It solidified a position. Daniel's model wasn't scalable in the traditional sense, and that was precisely what set it apart. The system continued operating. Hours passed without intervention. Entries occurred normally. Nothing exploded. Nothing crashed. The stability after such a significant decision was the greatest possible sign of success. The climax ended there without fireworks. The protagonist's transformation was visible, not in speeches, but in behavior. Daniel no longer sought to maximize immediate gains. He sought to preserve operational freedom. The antagonist, symbolically, had also reached his limit. Daniel received indirect news that the company where he had worked was undergoing further restructuring. Marcus remained in charge, but now he was dealing with a system too rigid to adapt too quickly. The irony was clear. The one who had bet everything on scale was now fighting against his own creation. Daniel felt no satisfaction in this, only detachment. The conflict had been resolved not through confrontation, but through a definitive divergence of paths. The climax revealed the central twist of the story. Making money with AI wasn't about exploiting the technology to its fullest potential, but about using technology to protect human choices. When he turned off his computer that day, Daniel realized he had achieved something rare. Not absolute independence, but sufficient sovereignty. He didn't depend on a boss, a specific algorithm, or external promises. The system was working, the decisions were his, and the central conflict was resolved. Time passed without announcing its arrival. There was no official marker separating before from after. The change occurred in the repetition of days, in the absence of artificial urgency, in the predictability intentionally constructed. Daniel realized this when he noticed that entire weeks went by without him needing to directly intervene in the system for more than a few hours. Automatic income was no longer an experiment or a gamble. It had become infrastructure. Discrete, functional, reliable. It didn't grow explosively, but sustained itself with its own logic. Each component had been designed to withstand external changes, not to shine in superficial metrics. The ultimate consequences of the decisions made at the climax began to become clear. The deliberate reduction in channels brought in a more aligned audience, less noise, less support, less emotional strain. Daniel came to understand that making money online wasn't about reaching the largest number of people, but about reaching the right people, with expectations that matched the proposition. His relationship with work had completely changed. Daniel no longer saw himself as someone out of touch with the market, but as someone who had redefined his role in it. He still studied, still tested, still adjusted. The difference was that now he did it by choice, not out of fear of obsolescence. Linda moved forward on her own path. Inspired but not dependent, she created a different model, suited to her profile. The conversations between the two became less frequent, but more meaningful. There was no longer a need for mutual validation. Both had crossed the tipping point and understood that autonomy was not a shared destiny, but an individual process. Daniel observed the surrounding scenario with a different perspective. The news about AI continued to be exaggerated, alternating between unrealistic promises and catastrophic warnings. He no longer reacted to this noise. He understood that technology was merely a means, powerful, yes, but incapable of replacing strategic thinking. The long-term impact of the choices he made became evident in how Daniel managed his time. He began dividing his week not into weekdays and weekends, but into energy cycles, working when it made sense, pausing when necessary. This flexibility didn't stem from a lack of responsibility, but from a well-designed system. Financially, stability allowed for something even more valuable than comfort: decision-making freedom. Daniel could say no to misaligned projects, postpone ideas without guilt, and invest in structural improvements without rushing for immediate returns. Money ceased to be the central objective and became a consequence of sound decisions. The conclusion of the journey didn't offer a grand lesson expressed in words. It manifested itself in simple actions. Daniel moved apartments when he wanted to, not when he was forced to. He traveled without asking permission. He studied new subjects without the pressure of being useful immediately. These small freedoms were the true outcome of the story. The antagonist, as a concept, dissolved. Marcus and the company remained in the past as a representation of a model that worked for many, but not for Daniel. There was no resentment, just recognition that different paths require different rules. Looking back, Daniel realized that automatic extra income was never the real goal. It was the vehicle. What he truly built was a system of sustainable choices, a way to use AI not to work more, nor to replace humans, but to consciously buying time. The story didn't end with extreme wealth or with a complete abandonment of effort. It ended with something rarer and more realistic: functional balance. Daniel would still face challenges, market changes, technical failures. None of that would disappear. The difference was that now he had the structure to respond, not react. The natural conclusion of that journey was silent, but definitive. Daniel no longer needed to prove that it was possible to make money online with artificial intelligence. He was living that reality day after day in a sustainable and deliberate way. And that, more than any number, was the real achievement. Months later, Daniel passed by a cafe near the old building where he used to work. He didn't go in. He just observed the activity. People rushing by, cell phones in hand, full schedules. Nothing there evoked nostalgia, only understanding. He knew that that world continued to function, and that there was nothing wrong with that. Back in the apartment, he opened his laptop out of habit, not obligation. The system remained active, silent, fulfilling its purpose. Daniel smiled discreetly. The future wasn't entirely defined, but one thing was certain. This time, he was in control of the next step. If this story made you reflect on work, income, and the intelligent use of technology, perhaps it's because it connects with something real in your own life. Daniel's journey isn't about luck, shortcuts, or miraculous promises. It's about decisions, structure, and long-term vision. If you want to better understand how artificial intelligence can be used practically and consciously to generate income online, keep reading. Share your opinion in the comments. Tell us what caught your attention most in this story and what questions arose along the way. If this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future stories and lessons.